The world never expected a political earthquake to erupt from two small nations on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Yet it happened in a way no analyst could have predicted, no intelligence agency could have forecast, and no global power could have stopped. It began with a sentence 10 seconds long spoken by a young military captain whose rise had already disrupted the old order. 10 seconds that shook a prime minister, ignited a nation, and awakened a continent. Those words came from Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, delivered in a speech that was supposed to be routine, perhaps even ceremonial. But instead, it became a spark that lit up the frustrations of millions from West Africa to the Caribbean. A spark that would rewrite alliances, challenge narratives, and expose what many had long whispered but were too afraid to say out loud. Traoré stood before his people, speaking plainly without teleprompters, without diplomatic filters, without fear. He said, "When hospitals collapse, when schools rot, when jobs disappear, corruption is not an accident. It is a theft from the people, and whether it is in Africa or across the ocean in Jamaica, the truth is the truth." The moment the word Jamaica dropped, everything changed. In Kingston, the capital of Jamaica, those words were met with disbelief, then anger, then panic. Prime Minister Andrew Holness, a man known for his measured tone, erupted with a fury that stunned even his closest advisors. Within hours, his office issued a 48-hour ultimatum. Captain Traoré must apologize publicly, or Jamaica would respond with what Holness called serious consequences. What those consequences were, nobody knew, but everyone felt the weight of the threat. And then came the unexpected twist. Traoré did not back down. He did not negotiate. He did not even hesitate. Standing before a crowd of 20,000 in Ouagadougou, he uttered the line that would explode across the world. "Truth does not bow to deadlines, and I will not apologize for standing with the people." Those words detonated like dynamite. In Jamaica, people poured into the streets by the tens of thousands. Students, farmers, mothers, nurses, factory workers, ordinary citizens who had long felt the weight of silence marched under a loud, unified chant. No apology. Fix corruption. Within 2 days, over 100,000 protesters filled Kingston's Freedom Avenue, carrying signs that read, "Traoré spoke for us. We want answers, not apologies. Stop stealing our future." The streets were boiling. And then, as if choreographed by destiny, another catalyst struck. A whistleblower leak surfaced. Not rumors, not theories, documents scanned, signed, timestamped. A massive corruption network exposed. More than $2 billion in ghost contracts, awarded to companies that didn't exist for projects that were never built. Names of senior ministers appeared on page after page. Funds meant for schools, clinics, community roads, youth centers gone. The leak hit social media like a tidal wave. On X, the hashtag number Traoré no apology reached 10 million views in 24 hours. On YouTube, creators from Africa, the Caribbean, and the diaspora broke it down, frame by frame, document by document. For the first time in years, Jamaica's youth saw a political scandal not buried, not ignored, not spun but laid out in daylight. And at the center of the storm was one man who didn't even live in their country, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. In Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds filled the streets to celebrate a leader who had spoken a truth that resonated far beyond borders. In Dakar, Bamako, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, and Accra, young people cheered his defiance. They shared his speech with captions like, "One Africa fights together. This is the voice we needed. A leader with backbone." And in Jamaica, the pressure on Prime Minister Holness grew unbearable. His advisors warned him that Traoré's refusal had turned the ultimatum into a political trap, one he had set for someone else, but had now fallen into himself. Because the moment Holness gave a countdown, the public began counting with him not to an apology but toward accountability. 48 hours passed, then 50, then 72. No apology came, no consequence came. No government statement came. Instead, something else happened. A coalition of civil society groups, lawyers, teachers, youth associations delivered a petition with over 500,000 signatures demanding a national anti-corruption bill. Inside Parliament, fractures appeared. Holness's own allies whispered that his response had turned Traoré into a symbol, a hero even. They warned him that the ultimatum had backfired, transforming a foreign leader's speech into a domestic referendum on corruption. The story had escaped his control, and around the world, analysts began asking the question that frightened old political elites. What if African unity isn't just an idea anymore but a force? In Burkina Faso, Traoré never gloated. He never mocked Holness. He simply said, "If speaking truth gives courage to others, then let it spread." And in that moment, something shifted. Pan-Africanism, which many had dismissed as romantic, outdated, or naive, felt suddenly alive again. Real, urgent, youth-driven, connected. Across Africa, young people saw how one voice from one country could echo in another, how corruption in one place could resonate in another, how leadership in one nation could inspire another. Borders felt thinner, voices felt louder, Africa felt closer, and what came next would stun Jamaica and the world forever, because the ultimatum didn't just fail. It backfired so completely that what began as a diplomatic clash transformed into something far bigger, a national awakening, a political rebirth, a moment that Jamaica would never forget. And it all started because one leader refused to obey a deadline and one nation refused to stay silent. The days following Captain Ibrahim Traoré's refusal unfolded like a political thriller. No writer could have scripted because real people, angry and awakened, were now the authors of their own story. At first, it was just murmurs in Jamaica. Small conversations in taxis, whispers in supermarkets, hushed tones at workplace lunch tables. People were stunned that someone outside their borders had said what many inside had kept buried for years. Stunned that he had said it publicly, and stunned that he had refused the ultimatum without blinking. But murmurs have power when they reflect truth. By the next morning, the mood had shifted. Not just shock, not just curiosity, but something much deeper, a sensation Jamaicans had not felt in a long time. A sense of possibility. At Kingston Technical University, a student stood on a fountain edge, holding her phone in the air as she replayed Traoré's statement on a small speaker. The sound wasn't perfect, but the message cut through the crowd like lightning. Truth does not bow to deadlines, and I will not apologize for standing with the people. Around her, dozens listened, then hundreds. The students exchanged glances, silent but electrifying. It was as if the words reached inside each person and pulled out something long suppressed. Frustration, exhaustion, hope, pride. Within an hour, chants broke out on campus. Within 3 hours, the protests had spread to the streets. Within 6 hours, Kingston, the heart of Jamaica, was alive with a roar the government had not heard in decades. As night fell, drone footage captured a scene that stunned even global TV networks. A sea of bodies marching with torches and cell phone lights, chanting in unison. No apology, fix corruption. No apology, fix corruption. There were no political parties behind it. No unions, no organizations. It was entirely organic, born from years of bottled frustration that had finally found its ignition point. And despite the chants being directed at their own government, the name on the signs was the same. Traoré spoke for us. By morning, the images had circled the globe. African news channels ran hour-by-hour coverage, showing the swelling crowds. Caribbean stations debated whether Traoré had committed diplomatic overreach, but even skeptical commentators were forced to acknowledge one thing. The protests were not about Traoré anymore. They were about Jamaica. And Andrew Holness, watching all of this unfold from the Prime Minister's residence, felt the ground shifting beneath him. He had expected a diplomatic skirmish, perhaps some social media chatter, maybe even criticism from regional leaders. But he had not expected, could not have expected, that his own people would turn Traoré's defiance into a rallying cry. His advisors urged him to hold firm, issue another statement, reassert authority, make an example of anyone who supported the foreign captain's comment. But Holness, pacing back and forth in his private office, understood something his advisors did not. If he miscalculated now, he would become the villain of his own story. His ultimatum had become a boomerang, and it was coming back fast. Yet what happened next would send his situation from difficult to catastrophic. It began with a message, anonymous, untraceable, sent to Jamaica's biggest investigative newsroom. A folder of files titled simply, "The Contracts They Hid." Inside the folder were invoices, tender forms, procurement lists, and scanned signatures, some blurred, others shockingly clear. All of them pointed to a single truth. Billions in public money allocated for schools, clinics, youth programs, and infrastructure had been siphoned into ghost companies. Companies with no staff, no offices, no equipment, no service history, but somehow they had won multi-million JMR projects. Some documents even showed payments made on the same day the tenders were issued, physically impossible unless the winners were pre-selected. It was the kind of scandal that could collapse governments. And then came the names, a handful of ministers, a few top bureaucrats, and one signature that appeared more than 20 times, the Prime Minister's close advisor, Benedict Kane. Within hours, the story hit the internet. Within minutes, it went viral. A single clip circulated everywhere, a journalist holding up two documents side by side during a live broadcast. "One is the authorization to fund a children's hospital in North Kingston," she said. "The other is a payment to a shell company with no address, approved the same week. The total missing is JMR 160 million. And that is only one project." The journalist's voice trembled as she flipped through more pages. Moments later, she added a line that would be quoted for days. "If true, this is not mismanagement. This is betrayal. In Kingston, people poured into the streets again, but this time the protests multiplied tenfold. It wasn't one location. It wasn't one group. It wasn't one cause. It was everyone. Nurses marched in their white coats. Bus drivers parked vehicles in the middle of the road and joined the crowds. Fishermen from the coast abandoned their nets to storm the city. Mothers from rural towns came carrying handwritten signs that read, "My child died in a broken clinic. Where did the money go? We want justice, not apologies." The protests were no longer a reaction, they were a movement. Social media exploded with videos of people crying, shouting, demanding accountability for years of hidden suffering. One video showed a school classroom with broken windows and rusted desks. Another showed a nurse mixing medicine with water because the supply room was empty. The people of Jamaica weren't just angry, they were heartbroken. And through it all, a young man far away in Burkina Faso became the symbol of their courage. In Ouagadougou, Traore's image appeared on murals painted overnight. Artists captured him raising his fist, not in arrogance, but in solidarity. Merchants displayed flags of both countries in their shops. In schoolyards, children chanted his message. Truth does not bow to deadlines. African youth across the continent felt a connection that transcended borders. For years, they had watched their governments operate in isolation, while foreign powers, real or perceived, asserted influence. But this moment felt different. This time, the spark came from within. And that is why in Dakar's Independence Square, thousands gathered chanting, "One struggle, one voice, one Africa." In Accra, parliamentarians held an emergency debate, discussing whether to issue a joint African statement supporting Jamaicans' right to protest corruption. In Dar es Salaam, an editorial in a major newspaper declared, "For decades we waited for a voice. Maybe Captain Traore is that voice." Even in capitals traditionally aligned with Western powers, the sentiment shifted. Commentators debated if this marked a turning point in African political consciousness, one where young leaders confronted old systems, and populations across nations responded in solidarity. Meanwhile, inside Jamaica's government, cracks widened. Cabinet ministers began distancing themselves from Holness. One privately admitted to reporters, "If the ultimatum never existed, we wouldn't be in this situation." The Minister of Social Development broke ranks entirely, urging the government to listen to the people instead of doubling down on diplomatic theatrics. But the most damaging blow came from within Holness's own party leadership council. They urged him to step back from the confrontation with Traore and address the corruption allegations directly. Holness, exhausted and unsure, stared at the council in disbelief. He had gone from commanding one of the region's most stable governments to standing on the edge of political collapse simply because a foreign leader had spoken bluntly. But the truth was more complicated. This wasn't about Traore. This was about what Jamaica had ignored for too long. Traore's speech had not created their problems, it had exposed them. The countdown clock he had set was now ticking for Holness himself. In Kingston streets, protesters projected a digital timer onto the Parliament building, not counting down to Traore's apology, but counting down to their own demands. 100 hours left for accountability. It was a symbolic reversal so powerful that it appeared on front pages worldwide. In international capitals, advisors to presidents and prime ministers whispered that this crisis might set a precedent. If African citizens realized their voice could ripple across the continent, and if leaders like Traore continued challenging established narratives, the geopolitical balance in Africa could shift dramatically. And that terrified some nations. Statements of concern emerged from Western diplomats. A few issued subtle criticisms of Traore's tone, hinting that his words were interfering in another nation's internal affairs. But those comments only made him more popular. For the first time in a long time, African youth had found someone who spoke with conviction but without fear of foreign backlash. In the Caribbean diaspora communities in London, Toronto, Lagos, Johannesburg, and New York, people held rallies holding signs that connected two continents, Jamaica plus Burkina Faso. One fight, Traore told the truth, Holness must answer, not threaten. And back in Kingston, as Wednesday's sunset painted the city in gold, a tidal wave of people gathered in Freedom Avenue once more. Not 10,000, not 20,000, but more than any protest the nation had seen since independence. Drone footage captured the largest march in Jamaican history. Torches, flags, drums, voices, a living sea, a movement impossible to silence. And the government, watching from fortified buildings behind closed curtains, understood what it had unleashed. The ultimatum had not intimidated the people. It had awakened them. The question now was no longer whether Traore would apologize. It was whether Jamaica's government would survive its own mistake. For days, the chants outside Parliament grew louder, stronger, more coordinated. What began as a single march had evolved into a nationwide encirclement. From dawn until long after midnight, Freedom Avenue pulsed with voices demanding something simple yet monumental: the truth. No party flags, no organized factions, just people who had had enough: students with tired eyes, grandmothers leaning on walking sticks, nurses still in scrubs after 12-hour shifts, fishermen smelling of sea salt, bus drivers still wearing their route vests, teachers holding textbooks as protest signs. It was the entire heart of Jamaica standing as one. From inside the heavily guarded marble building, Prime Minister Andrew Holness watched the swelling crowds on muted screens. His advisors hovered behind him, whispering strategies that were increasingly desperate. "You can still salvage this," one insisted. "Issue a strong statement against foreign interference." Another suggested cutting internet service to stop the protests from growing. "We can't let Traore dictate our national mood," he warned. But Holness knew the truth they refused to say out loud. This was no longer about Traore. The captain from Burkina Faso had simply articulated aloud what millions had felt privately. He had said the words that had been stuck in their throats for years, and once spoken, those words had unlocked something unstoppable. The clock outside Parliament continued to count down. The protesters had set it to 100 hours for the government to respond to the corruption leaks, not the ultimatum issued days before. The symbolism was unmistakable. The people had taken control of the narrative. The power was shifting. Inside a cramped newsroom on the east side of Kingston, journalists worked feverishly through stacks of leaked files. Every hour, more evidence surfaced: contracts without deliverables, budget allocations that evaporated into thin air, approvals signed off by the same three officials again and again. The ghost companies linked back to a web of shell corporations managed by people with close ties to the ruling party. The numbers were staggering: billions missing across an 8-year period. Money that could have built hospitals, modernized schools, funded youth programs, repaired broken roads, elevated entire rural communities into the digital age. The leaks didn't slow down. They accelerated. Each hour delivered a new document bombshell, and with each revelation, the protests grew. On the third night, something extraordinary happened. Nurses formed a human chain across the front of the National Children's Hospital, one of the facilities that had been promised upgrades and equipment. They held candles and photos of young patients who had died due to lack of supplies, outdated equipment, or delayed treatment. A young nurse, barely 22, stepped forward to address a live camera. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that cut straight through the noise. "We're not protesting for politics," she said. "We are protesting because our children die while money meant for their care is stolen. If Captain Traore hadn't spoken, the world would still be blind to our suffering. We owe him nothing, but we owe the truth everything." Her words spread across social media like wildfire. That night, the hashtag changed. Number Traore No Apology became Number Jamaica Wake. The movement had broken free of its origin story. It now belonged wholly to the people. Across the ocean in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré observed the unfolding events with a mixture of admiration and caution. He never intended to ignite a revolution in another country. He had simply spoken a truth that applied to his own nation and inadvertently mirrored the pain of another. Yet now the world's eyes were on him. At a small gathering with students in Ouagadougou, a young girl asked him, "Sir, do you regret what you said?" Traoré paused for a long moment before answering. "How can I regret speaking the truth?" he said. "When the truth has given a people back their voice." The room fell silent. Cameras were rolling. The clip spread instantly, further elevating his image as a leader who didn't bend to political pressure. Back in Jamaica, the pressure inside government reached boiling point. Ministers began resigning quietly. A few were fired publicly. The Speaker of Parliament summoned an emergency council meeting, demanding answers. Holness's inner circle was shrinking by the hour. Rumors circulated that the military leadership was growing uneasy, refusing to be used as a tool against their own citizens. And yet Holness hesitated to address the nation. Every draft speech prepared for him sounded like a confession or an excuse. There was no way to spin the documents. There was no foreign plot to blame. There was no scapegoat convincing enough. The corruption was real. The anger was real. The awakening was real. On the 5th day after the ultimatum, something unprecedented happened. Tens of thousands of protesters marched in complete silence for exactly 5 minutes. No chants, no music, no drums, just silence, a silence that echoed across Kingston like a moral earthquake. Then, as the clock struck the end of the silent march, they erupted in a unified roar. No apology, accountability. Inside Parliament, the sound shook the windows. Holness finally addressed the nation that evening. His speech was short, visibly strained, and devoid of the confidence he once commanded. He declared that the ultimatum to Captain Traore was no longer a priority, and that the government would focus its attention on addressing the concerns raised by the Jamaican people. It was a vague, almost pleading concession, and the crowd outside watching on giant screens knew it. He had not said the words clearly, but the implication was unmistakable. The ultimatum was dead. It died not with a formal withdrawal, not with diplomatic negotiations, but under the weight of the voices outside his office. The people had crushed it, and something shifted in the air when the announcement aired. It was not celebration, not yet. It was recognition. The people had tasted their own power and they liked it. They knew now that change was not something they begged for. Change was something they demanded. The next day, civic organizations and youth groups delivered a massive petition to Parliament, over 500,000 signatures collected in just 72 hours. The petition demanded immediate drafting of a new anti-corruption bill, creation of an independent watchdog committee, and prosecution of all officials named in the leaks. No political party could ignore that number. No government could pretend it didn't exist. And so, for the first time in the nation's history, the bill was put on the legislative calendar under urgent national priority. Worldwide, analysts were stunned. Political scientists on international networks declared Jamaica's uprising a textbook case of civic reawakening. Newspapers called it the Caribbean Spring. African commentators called it the Traore effect. And in social forums, people debated whether this moment represented the dawn of a new global movement. Citizens reclaiming their countries from corruption, one nation at a time. But not everyone welcomed the wave of change. Behind closed doors in foreign embassies, diplomats exchanged worried messages. Some governments had long-standing interests in Jamaica's political stability or instability. Traore's influence, even unintentional, threatened to inspire similar uprisings elsewhere. Some saw him as a hero. Others saw him as a problem. In the days that followed, anonymous editorials appeared in Western media outlets criticizing Traore's recklessness, lack of diplomatic maturity, and potential to destabilize vulnerable regions. But these criticisms only strengthened his image among African youth, who had grown tired of outsiders dictating how their leaders should behave. Traore didn't respond to the attacks. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than their criticism. Meanwhile, Jamaica continued to transform. Aerial images taken on the 10th day of protests showed entire highways filled with people walking together, some holding flags, others holding signs, many simply marching with determination etched on their faces. It was the largest demonstration in the island's history, yet despite the massive crowds, there were no riots, no looting, no violence. The movement was disciplined, almost sacred in its unity. Volunteers handed out water bottles. Medical teams walked among the crowds offering first aid. Local restaurants distributed food for free. Churches turned their halls into rest stations. Taxi drivers shuttled elderly protesters to the safest vantage points. This wasn't chaos. This was a society rebuilding itself from the ground up. One image went viral worldwide. A drone shot showing a massive formation of protesters standing together to form the word "Enough." It appeared on front pages from Lagos to New York to Johannesburg. On the 11th day, the Speaker of Parliament announced that the government would fast-track the anti-corruption bill with full transparency, inviting civil society leaders to sit in on drafting sessions. It was unprecedented, and then he said something that cemented this moment in history. The Jamaican people have spoken, and today this parliament chooses to listen. That sentence alone sent the crowds into thunderous applause. The political tide had completely turned. In the final hours of the protest's 12th day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and a soft orange glow bathed the city, a young protester climbed atop a statue in Freedom Square and raised a hand-painted flag combining the colors of Jamaica and Burkina Faso. The crowd roared in approval. Someone filmed the moment. The clip ricocheted across the internet, captioned, "We are not separate, we are one fight." Across Africa, people shared the video with pride. Senegalese students chanted Traore's words at rallies. Kenyan youth staged symbolic marches for accountability. Ghanaian activists held public vigils calling for similar audits of government spending. Pan-African solidarity wasn't just an idea anymore. It was happening. In that moment, the story had evolved beyond any politician, beyond any country. It had become a message sent across oceans. When the people rise, no ultimatum survives. When the people speak, truth gains power. When the people awaken, leaders change or fall. Jamaica was awake. Burkina Faso was watching. Africa was inspired, and the world finally was listening. What happened next in Jamaica was something no politician, no analyst, and no global observer could have predicted. Because while Prime Minister Andrew Holness and his cabinet believed that the storm would pass, the storm was only beginning. What Traore had ignited was no longer a political argument. It had transformed into a cultural awakening, a generational confrontation, and ultimately an irreversible shift in Jamaica's political landscape. What started as a disagreement between two leaders had become a battle between truth and silence, between the people and the system, between the future and the past, and most importantly, between courage and fear. For decades, Jamaicans had complained quietly, whispered cautiously, and hoped passively. But now, sparked by a leader thousands of miles away who refused to bow to power, the people suddenly realized something powerful. They did not need permission to demand dignity. They did not need approval to claim justice. They did not need an apology to awaken. So, when the government attempted to minimize the protests, labeling them emotional overreactions, the people answered in a way no one expected. They organized, they expanded, and they grew louder. Church groups marched next to university students. Taxi drivers marched next to teachers. Nurses marched next to street vendors. Elders marched beside youth who had never attended a protest before. For the first time in years, Jamaica was moving as one, and soon the pressure burst through every crack in the system. As more leaked documents emerged, including details of the ghost contracts, invoices for phantom school renovations, inflated procurement deals, and entire hospitals receiving only 12% of approved funding, the government found itself drowning in its own contradictions. Officials went on television speaking defensively, aggressively, and sometimes incoherently. Many tried to blame the opposition. Others attempted to blame the media, but nothing worked, because the people had already made up their minds. Corruption wasn't an accusation. It was a lived experience. Parents didn't need evidence to prove schools were collapsing, they saw it every morning. Patients didn't need documents to know hospitals were failing, they felt it in the waiting rooms. Farmers didn't need reports to know markets were broken, they lived the consequences every day. For years, Jamaicans had been told to be patient, while officials signed contracts worth billions of dollars. And now, with those very contracts exposed as fraudulent, the population felt insulted, not shocked. Traore didn't create the problem. He simply said aloud what Jamaicans had always known. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré watched the events unfold with a calm, strategic precision. Despite international pressure, diplomatic warnings, and veiled threats, he refused to issue the apology demanded by Jamaica Labour Party administration. Instead, he sent a short, direct statement: "Truth serves the people. I will never apologize for serving the people." This single sentence ricocheted across Jamaica like a sonic wave. Students added it to posters. Protesters painted it on walls. Artists turned it into songs, and within days, thousands were chanting it in the streets. Jamaica Labour Party Ultimatum, once presented as a symbol of strength, now looked like a comical attempt to silence the inevitable. His government tried one more move. They threatened to pass emergency regulations to control unlawful gatherings. But the move backfired spectacularly. Civil society groups condemned it. Lawyers rejected it. Even several MPs from Jamaica Labour Party-owned coalition refused to support it, fearing the political cost. And then something unprecedented happened. Former Prime Minister Alicia Rohn, respected across party lines, released a public video saying, "This is not about Traore, this is about Jamaica's soul. If the government fears the truth, the government fears the people." Within hours, the video hit 2 million views. Within 12 hours, Jamaica Labour Party approval rating hit its lowest point in 5 years. Within 24 hours, the ultimatum became irrelevant. By the time the 48-hour deadline expired, Jamaica had already moved on. People stopped watching the clock. They were watching history instead. International news networks began reporting on Jamaica's awakening. Analysts referred to it as the Caribbean People's Wave. Commentators said the protests were the largest since the 1970s. African journalists described Jamaica as the new frontline of global South consciousness. And across the ocean, several West African nations released statements praising Jamaica's citizens for standing up for transparency. But the most powerful global reaction came from African youth. From Dakar to Harare, from Accra to Bissau, millions posted messages like, "Traore speaks for us. Jamaica, Africa stands with you. We are one people, same struggle, same liberation." Suddenly, Jamaica was at the center of a conversation much bigger than itself. A conversation about sovereignty. A conversation about leadership. A conversation about the right of nations to challenge internal injustice without fearing external consequences. Traore didn't intend to become a symbolic figure in Jamaica's movement, but that is exactly what happened. Meanwhile, inside Jamaica, the cracks within the government widened dramatically. Whistleblowers came forward. Investigative journalists released new details, and polls showed that 68% of citizens wanted a full corruption inquiry. But the real shock came when members of Jamaica Labour Party-owned cabinet began distancing themselves publicly. One minister admitted mistakes were made. Another said transparency must be restored. A third secretly met with civil society leaders to negotiate a national anti-corruption pact. Suddenly, Jamaica Labour Party was standing alone, defiant, isolated, and increasingly out of touch. On the morning of the sixth day, something symbolic happened. The police, instructed to break up the protests, refused to use force. Instead, officers placed their shields down and allowed demonstrators to march peacefully through Kingston. For a brief moment, the city fell silent, not out of fear, but out of awe. When state power refuses to fight the people win. Within hours, a major committee announced that it would draft the Clean Hands Act, a sweeping anti-corruption bill demanding independent audits of all ministries, full digital transparency of public spending, citizen oversight, panels, a permanent corruption tracking portal, stricter laws for procurement fraud. Over 500,000 Jamaicans signed the petition supporting it. The government could no longer hide. The ultimatum was dead. The silent strategy was dead. The narrative was dead. But something else was born, a new, fearless Jamaica led not by politicians, but by the people themselves. By day 10, the protests had evolved from anger to unity. People brought food to each other. Street performers played drums. Artists painted murals. Teachers hosted mini lessons for children attending with their parents. The movement became beautiful, peaceful, and unbreakable. Jamaica Labour Party finally addressed the nation. His voice was heavy, his posture defeated, his words carefully chosen. He announced that the ultimatum would be withdrawn. He announced that the Anti-Corruption Committee would proceed. He announced that the government would listen to the people. But by then, something irreversible had happened. Traore's refusal to apologize had transformed him from a foreign politician into a symbol of courage in Jamaica. Even his critics admitted he said what needed to be said. He refused to be intimidated. And because of that, Jamaica finally stood up. The final blow to the old political order came when a coalition of youth groups, civil organizations, teachers, nurses, farmers, musicians, and pastors announced a national unity march. Over 300,000 people participated, one of the largest gatherings in the Caribbean's democratic history. They carried signs that read, "No more silence, truth before power. Jamaica deserves better." And the most iconic banner of all, "No apology, only justice." In Burkina Faso, Traore delivered a final message not to the government, but to Jamaica's people. You woke up because you chose truth. You marched because you chose courage. You changed history because you chose yourselves. The world cannot stop a people who decide to rise. It became the quote of the movement. News anchors repeated it. Protesters chanted it. Students turned it into a viral remix. Artists painted it across Kingston's walls. By the time the dust settled, Jamaica was no longer the same nation. The ultimatum that was meant to intimidate ended up igniting the largest anti-corruption movement in a generation. Traore, a leader from across the ocean, had unintentionally become a catalyst for Jamaica's awakening. And the people's students, workers, mothers, nurses, farmers rewrote the direction of their own future. That is the moment when Jamaica stopped waiting for heroes and became its own. The world watched, Africa celebrated, and for the first time in a long time, Jamaica stood taller, louder, and stronger than ever before. Because a nation awakened cannot be put back to sleep, and a people who discover their voice will never lose it again.